Hello, good afternoon and welcome to Unacademy IAS, a one-stop destination for all the English medium civil services aspirants. Today, the Finance Minister on the floor of the Parliament has laid down the economic survey documents. There are two documents. One is basically detailing all the chapters and the second one consists of lot of statistical information. Both of the documents put together are just around 630 pages. So in today's session, we will not have a detailed discussion of all the 630 pages. What we will do is discuss what is the first impression of the economic survey. What are the key highlights which are given in the economic survey, and going forward, we will also have a detailed discussion of this document which is necessary for the upcoming civil services examination. Let's have a look at the key highlights. Point number one, the survey talks about real GDP growth rate. The global market has been affected by various events that have taken place between the countries and within the countries themselves. For example, the war or the fight between Russia and Ukraine, the disruptions that have taken place in the Middle East, and some of the experiences of the respective countries in their economies has had an impact on the global growth rate. According to the survey, the global growth rate is pegged at around 3.2%. It is at 3.2%. But for the Indian economy, the growth rate that the survey estimates for the current financial year is 6.5% to 7%. And for the previous financial year, that is for the financial year 24, the survey has given the data of 8.2% GDP growth rate. A very important point to note here is, though the disruptions have caused, or there are a lot of disruptions which have happened in the recent past, the experience of the countries is completely different. The impact of the disruptions are completely different. Some of the countries, based on their dependence on the global trade, based on the reforms or the measures which have been undertaken by the central banker, the impact of all of these events is uneven. But in the context of India, for the previous financial year, the real GDP growth rate, a point to note, a real GDP growth rate of 8.2% has been registered for the financial year 24, and for the current financial year, it is estimated at 6.5% to 7%. And if you are reading the newspapers, you would know this. Reserve Bank of India very recently has upgraded, has increased, revised its GDP growth rate from 7% to 7.2%. IMF has revised upwards the GDP growth rate for India for the current financial year to 7%. So as such, what is the government of India expecting or estimating in terms of GDP is not very far away from what other institutions are actually giving. Now this is in the context of real GDP growth rate. Now regarding the other factors, the survey has talked about investment in the form of gross fixed capital formation. In the last couple of years, there has been a lot of discussion regarding the debt of the households, the rising debt in the households coming under a lot of pressure, the private sector controlling its investments or reducing its investments on account of lower growth, lower demand in the market. The economic survey says that the data which has been spoken about, for example, let's say the debt of the households, the household debt has actually increased, no doubt regarding that. But the households increasingly have started investing in more and more assets in the market. This was the argument given by the government earlier as well, and even the chief economic advisor has given the same argument multiple times, that the households are not under stress as it is written, as it is, let's say, told by many of the experts. Rather, the households have started investing a lot of money in financial market. They have started investing a lot of money in real assets such as real estate. And as a result of this kind of an investment, the debt of the households have actually increased. And according to the survey, the status, or let's say the position of the households, has actually improved post-pandemic in India. Now, regarding the gross fixed capital formation, the growth in the GFCF, according to the survey, has been pegged at around 9%. And this has been aided by raising of lot of funds in the market. For example, in the primary market, the private sector, I repeat, the private sector has raised the capitalization of around 10 trillion rupees. Around 10 lakh crore rupees worth of funds have been raised from the primary market. So again, the argument of the survey is, the private sector, there is the argument that it is investing lesser. No, the private sector has started investing more and more. And that is pretty much visible in the primary market funds which have been raised by the private sector company. The households have started investing money in the real assets, in the financial assets. And in addition to this, all of this has been aided by a higher investment by Government of India. And please understand, although this is not mentioned in the article or in the economic survey documents, there is a separate parallel argument regarding this. That is, the government is investing a lot of money and this is driving the growth in the Indian economy. But this kind of a growth is not sustainable. Private sector has to revive, has to invest more and more money. Government, after borrowing huge amount of money, cannot keep on driving the growth in the Indian economy. And the survey basically states that no doubt private sector is increasing its investment. Households have started increasing their investment. All of this has been aided by the government. In fact, the terminology that they use is the concept of crowding in. The idea of crowding in. The government's increased investments has attracted a lot of private sector investment. This is the gross fixed capital formation argument. Third one is investment. The Government of India is investing more and more money in development of infrastructure. In the development of infrastructure. For example, if you look at how much is the total capex, I repeat, how much is the total capex by Government of India? The capex that was announced by the government in the interim budget was 11.1 lakh crore rupees. 11.1 lakh crore rupee. And that's a huge amount of investment. Compared to the previous years, the capital expenditure that has been invested by the government is much, much higher. And this capital investment or this kind of a investment has actually led to more and more job generation in the Indian economy. It has actually led to crowding in of the private sector investment. It has contributed to higher GDP growth rate in the Indian economy. And tomorrow when the budget is presented, again it is estimated that the government's investment, government's capital expenditure would also be much, much higher for the current financial year. And whenever you look at the capital expenditure, a very important point to note is that the capital expenditure has a multiplier effect. It contributes very greatly to the increase in the GDP. And that's the reason the capex plays a very, very important role. And point number 2, historically if you see, the government's capital expenditure directly done has increased. And not only this, in addition to this, the government also has provided a lot of capital expenditure assistance to state governments. For example, the government runs or has launched an initiative, a program where 50-year interest-free loans are provided for the state governments to borrow and invest under the capital head itself. So the third very important parameter that is being discussed in the economic survey is the investment. Investment from the government, investment from the private sector, etc. Fourth very important focus area is the inflation rate. No doubt in recent times, one of the burning topics, one of the issues that has grabbed a lot of attention is the inflation rate. And within inflation rate, the vegetable inflation, or let's say the food inflation, pulses inflation, has led to a lot of discussion, and according to various experts, one of the reasons regarding the performance of political parties in the recently concluded Lok Sabha election. The economic survey says post-pandemic, because of external factors as well as internal factors, retail inflation rate was very high. In fact, in some of the years, retail inflation rate was more than 7%. For the financial year 23, retail inflation was 6.7%. 6.7%. And in the financial year 24, the Government of India as well as the Reserve Bank of India have implemented a lot of reforms, as a result of which the retail inflation rate for the financial year 24 is averaging 5.4%. 5.4%. So have a look at this. With the implementation of the reforms, we have been able to drag down the inflation rate. And not only this, out of all the 36 union territories plus states, in 29 of them, retail inflation has come down. We have been able to control the retail inflation. In those states where the inflation rate has actually gone up, it is on account of the disruption that has been caused because of monsoon, disruption in the supply of agriculture commodities because of unseasonal rainfall. And specifically in these states where the retail inflation has increased in the last financial year, retail inflation is greater. It has been observed that retail inflation rate is greater in a rural part of India compared to urban part of India. And that is again just a conceptual argument here. That is on account of the food and beverages, the food articles being given a higher weightage in case of rural CPI compared to urban CPI. But having said so, the survey says on a larger picture, if you look at the larger picture, because of the reforms such as export restrictions, reduction in the tariff, supply in the domestic market through intervention by the government, etc., etc., we have been able to bring down the retail inflation, and specifically within the retail inflation, the core inflation. Within the retail inflation, the core inflation has come down to one of the lowest in the last 4 years. One of the lowest in the last 4 years, and that's a very important point to make a note of. This is regarding retail inflation. What about external balance? How India has performed compared to, let's say, or in the global market in the last one financial year. Post-pandemic, there was a huge disruption regarding exports as well as imports. In the financial year 24, the survey says our exports have improved, so have the imports. But more importantly, if you look at the current account deficit, which includes the imports as well as exports of goods as well as services, the current account deficit in the previous financial year was 2% of GDP. 2% of GDP. And for the financial year 24, it has actually come down to 0.7% of GDP. Please understand the importance of it. 0.7% of GDP. What is the importance of it? There is a current account deficit, but no doubt the current account deficit has actually narrowed. It is much lower. And this narrowing of the current account deficit is primarily on account of huge amount of inward remittances. According to the World Bank report, India has received one of the largest remittances in the global market. India is ranked 1 in that. The remittances India has received is more than $120 billion. That is one very important contributing factor to reduce the CAD. Second very important factor is the growth in the services sector. Mind you, the growth in the services sector. India's services sector has grown as well as exported a lot to the international market. Because of this growth in the service sector exports, we have been able to bring down the current account deficit. In fact, for the last quarter of the previous financial year, for the first time in a lot of years, in more than 4 years, we experienced a surplus in the current account deficit. A surplus in the current account, not deficit, in the current account. That it has not happened for many years. It has happened for the first time in the last 4 years. In terms of, let's say, import cover, what has been the performance? Because we have accumulated huge amount of forex reserves, and the size of the forex reserves alone cannot tell you whether these forex reserves are sufficient or not sufficient. Generally, we measure that in terms of import cover. According to the latest data, not given in the survey, but the latest data, India's forex reserves have reached the all-time high of more than $660 billion. And the survey makes a note that the forex reserves have increased to such an extent that the import cover of 10 months, we have it now. We have an import cover of 10 months. That is, the forex reserves which are there with us is sufficient to take care of 10 months worth of imports in the current financial year. And not only this, 98% of the external debt, I repeat, 98% of the external debt, we can satisfy that with the amount of reserves that we have. So this is a rising state of, or let's say improved state of external balance for India in the last one financial year. Now regarding the growth, please understand, the survey identifies 6 priority areas or 6 strategic areas that need to be targeted in the coming days. But before that, the survey also says that for the current financial year, we will be able to achieve a very high GDP growth rate in the range of 6.5 to 7%. And in the last financial year, as already mentioned, we have hit a real GDP growth rate of 8.2%. And a notable factor is that in 3 quarters, in the last financial year, in 3 quarters, our GDP growth rate was more than 8%. Now, considering all of these factors, there are also certain concerns which could have a limiting impact on the performance of Indian economy, such as external factors, wars, or rising crude oil prices, or climate risk. In addition to that, even in the domestic market, there could be certain structural factors, including, let's say, the impact of El Nino or lower rainfall regarding agriculture sector productivity. So having looked at all of these factors, the 6 strategy areas that have been targeted for achieving a higher growth for the Indian economy are: 1, we need to promote more and more private investments. That is, without any doubt, we need to do that. And if India can achieve a higher GDP growth rate consistently with a stable inflation rate, no doubt we'll be able to attract huge amount of investment. Because the government alone cannot drive the growth. It cannot be driven only by the government. You require a lot of private sector investment. Second, expanding the performance of micro, small, medium enterprises. In terms of GDP growth rate, services, manufacturing, exports, employment. We need to expand the performance of MSMEs. Recognize the agriculture sector as a growth engine, and any issue that the sector faces, we should be able to address that particular issue. Fourth one, securing financing for the green transition. This is one of the very important pillars that is being targeted by the government for the last couple of years, and they will continue to do so. lot of reforms have been undertaken by the government to promote green infrastructure, green energy production, or transition to net zero emission target by 2070. So again, the target here is, or the focus here is, secure financing for this kind of a green transition. Fifth one is bridging the education employment gap. There is a lot of discussion regarding the gap between what is the educated population in India and how many of them, how much percentage of them they are able to get the jobs in the market. How much is the employability? There is a concern regarding skilled labor, vocational training, whether this graduate is able to or is having sufficient skill set to be absorbed in the labor market. That particular gap that is existing between employment as well as the, let's say, the education, we want to bridge that particular gap. And the sixth and the final strategy area, which is important for achieving Amrit Kal in India, building the state capacity as well as capability in terms of policy formulation, policy implementation. So these are the 6 very important strategic areas which have been identified by the economic survey for the year 23 and 24. So this is basically the first impression of this economic survey. Going forward, we will be having a lot of discussions regarding the chapters or the concepts which are discussed in the survey document. If you like this initiative, hit the like button. Subscribe to our YouTube channel right now if you're yet to subscribe to it. Thank you. Have a great day.